Chair and all the members of the Assembly for having this important hearing. I am the public advocate of the City of New York. I am a public school baby from preschool to master's, public educated in the Brooklyn public school system in particular. Just two things I do want to say very, very quickly. One is I have to admittedly say that I know that my testimony is with the color of having been through a Brooklyn Tech. And to be quite honest, if I hadn't, I probably would be on the other side of this issue. And so I want to be clear about that. But I also want to say, if we got rid of all of the 8 specialized high schools, forget about the tests, if we just took them out of discussion, what we would have is the most segregated system of education in the entire country. And what we would have was a system that was not educating black and brown students in particular, which says to me the focus of some of this discussion is a red herring of a system that is not working, and that is a big issue for me. The reason I support at least part of the access being SHSAT is because if it was any other measure, I would not have gotten into Brooklyn Tech, and I am not alone. There are a lot of people. In fact, when myself and the Assemblyman I heard her speaking went to Brooklyn Tech, over 50% of the students were black and brown. In about the 80s, over 60% of the students were black and brown. Stuyvesant was never that great. It's gotten atrociously worse, however. And so we are negating a conversation about what happened from that time until now. I don't think that black and brown students got dumber. And so we are missing a part of the conversation about what happened. And I believe it is needlessly pitting communities against each other. Two of the things that I believe happened was we did get rid of, we reacted to tracking, which has its own problems we should address, but we reacted to that in a knee jerk and got rid of all of the gifted and talented programs for many of the schools, including mine, which was Philippa Schuyler and was a feeder school. In addition, the Asian community started taking the tests at an enormous rate. And I cannot fault them, and I will not fault that community for finding an access point and working it. And to be honest, we have to remember that when a lot more people take the test, and if they have test prep, the scores go higher. So the access point to the school goes a little higher. And so we cannot disregard what it means to be prepped to take that test. But many students of more color also are simply not taking the test. And I need to speak up for people like myself and Kirsten Ford, who's going to be testifying later, and Keith White, who's an attorney for Christian Cultural Center, who actually was about to be left back in the 8th grade. And if it wasn't for the test, he would have been left back. And I just want to be clear. I've never been a good student until grad school. So if they had used grades, if they had used behavior, I was notorious for behavioral problems. If they had used attendance, I cut my first class in the 8th grade. Any combination of that, I would not have had an access point to this quality education. That may have changed the trajectory of my entire school career and my entire career period. I also believe in a red herring because I believe all of the people on this discussion, everybody who agrees with me, who doesn't agree with me, the one thing we're doing is elevating the problems with diversity in the school, and we should all agree on that point. I'm not here to attack anyone because I think, and I know everyone just wants everybody to have a quality education. But I do believe the focus on these 8 schools are missing the point in so many ways, because one thing that we do know we clearly have the ability to do is change so many of the multiple criteria schools right now. And I present to you that some of the top tier multiple criteria schools, like Townsend Harris, like Eleanor Roosevelt, are atrocious when it comes to diversity. Why are we not spending any of this time about changing who goes to those 2 schools and so many other of the schools that can also provide quality education? We're absolutely saying nothing about that. I haven't heard the chancellor or the mayor or anyone saying what we're doing about those schools. We seem to be focused on the schools which we need more permission to change. That to me says it is a red herring that is being used, I think, maybe for political reasons and is pitting communities against each other. I believe, and this is just me, that this is about access points to quality education. and everybody should have an access point to quality education in this system in its entirety. I also believe that perhaps you can have some seats available in these schools for people like me who were able to show what they can do with the test. I also support opening up some seats for people who can show what they can do with multiple criteria. For the life of me, I do not understand why we have to take away one access point to provide another. And in the terms of leadership, providing two pathways, access points, lets all students show that they have the ability to excel in these schools without pitting communities needlessly against each other. Thank you.
Mr. Williams, thank you very much for your testimony. To the members of the panel going forward, if you wish to ask questions of any of the panelists, just give a signal to Fletcher in the back and he'll relay that to me. And while that's going on, just a question, because it puzzled me when I was looking at the stats, and you remarked on it. Back whenever we had students in Brooklyn Tech, that was a decent, if you want to put it with that word.
It was the majority.
Okay. And then there was a decline. However, at the same time, it was a majority in Brooklyn Tech. In Stuyvesant, it wasn't. It kind of reflected what it is today. Do you have any answer to that, why that was the case?
Well, I do know that there is and still consistently have problems with educating black and brown people in general. I do know that there were feeder schools, a lot of them in Brooklyn in particular, and that may have helped with why so many people went to Brooklyn Tech. I do know that some people got accepted to other schools like Bronx Science, but lived in Brooklyn and still went to Brooklyn. So I would love to see what were the actual scores and people who decided to go to Brooklyn Tech because of the transportation. But I don't want to make any mistake about it. I think any system you put in place will, because of the nature of this country and this city, will have black and brown people at a disadvantage. I do want to say maybe in the 80s, 90s, it might have been 15 or so percent black in Stuyvesant, which is terrible, but it's atrociously now maybe 1 or 2%. That makes no sense. But we should be asking the questions of what happened. Like, we seem to be skipping over decades and just immediately pretending like we woke up and it was 2019, and that's not what happened. I also believe that immigration is a big part of it. I would have been horrified to hear people screaming at the Caribbean community, saying that there is too many Caribbean people in Brooklyn Tech, and now we should change the system. And there are people. I just went to my anniversary for the reunion for 25 years, and there were people who were talking about how the standard of tech went down when it was primarily black and Latino. And so it's appalling. But this is what we do when there's limited resources and people are trying to get those resources. And the same way I would have been appalled at people talking to the Caribbean community about why they all now in Brooklyn Tech, I refuse to do that with the Asian community. And what we need to do is provide more resources which are available instead of keeping it so small so that people are fighting for them.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Walter Mosley.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Public Advocate. It's a pleasure to be in your presence, and you're an inspiration to many, many New Yorkers and to many, many Americans. I commend you for what you've done up to this point. Good to see you, brother.
Thank you.
I was reading an article in the Diplomat, 2017 article. It said, "Can test obsessed China change?" And as the public advocate for can test obsessed China change? And as the public advocate for 9 million or so New Yorkers, your job is to represent not only the 1.1 million New Yorkers, but their parents and their communities. Can you kind of explain what will be your role when you kind of unpack a multitude of things? So you asked how we got to this point. A lot of it is cultural. Please, if I mispronunciate this, the GACO test prep, or the GACO test prep or test culture in China, which is a high-stake testing, which takes place over 2 or 3 days, which kind of predetermines at a very young age where students, particularly in China, go in terms of the colleges that they'll be qualified to attend and not attend. Two, the educational, the DOE as a system, and some of the faults that many of my colleagues have highlighted. And then three, the economics of it all. The economics from a parochial standpoint, in terms of the economies that have been built into test prepping, and whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about test prep programs, whether we're talking about one-on-one tutors and tutorial programs within these certain communities, and then the economics of high test taking from a commercial standpoint side in terms of contracts that are allocated, as my colleague so noted in his statement, Assemblyman Barron, and the monies in the millions and billions of dollars that are created from these exams, which we can find fault in determining whether or not they really are valid indicators in identifying the best of the best when we talk about these specialized public high schools and the seats that are going to be filled by those said students. So, it's a lot to unfold and unpack, but what do you see the role of the Public Advocate's Office in this very complex and convoluted issue that spreads beyond just a single test and spreads beyond education?
I think what happened, same thing that happened when we had an influx of Caribbean students. The system is unfair, and just like the multiple criteria schools that are top ranked now, there wasn't that much entry. And maybe I don't know, but maybe the Caribbean community back then discovered that this test exists. If we can take this test, we have access to the same quality education. My guess is that same thing happened with the Asian community. I agree from what I've read, there are issues with the way some of the parents are obsessed about the test. I also think that we should look into the test preps if all that money is being spent and making sure that people aren't being oppressed with them. But I see that as ancillary but separate to making sure that everybody has an access point. And my access point was the test. And I'm happy to support providing an access point to someone in the same school who can show what they can do with multiple criteria. I'm just not sure if we go back to, say, the 90s, why those students should not have been, why my friend who would have gotten left back should not have had access, because he obviously was able to do the work, but that barrier would have been provided. And so what I'm saying is that for me, there's an answer that satisfies everyone who shows what they can do, and it seems like it's not even being considered. This either or thing always is a little frustrating to me.
As a public advocate, your role in the city's budget process, what you're going through now, do you see a way in which we can put our money where our mouth is when it comes to some of the recommendations you're making, and what are some of the things that are really not negotiable when it comes from an educational standpoint in terms of allocating resources that would help us to kind of alleviate the systemic problems we're seeing now, particularly within our specialized public high schools?
I would start from the state and ask the governor to fully fund the CFE, which hasn't been done in a very long time, and I applaud the members of this panel who pushed. We did get some additional money, but I think some of those monies would be helpful. I do support many of the council members' push to bring back some of the gifted talent programs and to provide for some of the test prep that people have been discussing. I firmly believe. I mean, look, many of my friends, I didn't actually study for the test. I had no test prep, and actually most of the teachers in my school, except for Miss Ned in the 5th grade, thought I was not going to make it. And we just took the test, and based on my grades and behavior and all that, people were just pretty shocked. I think that access to these things will help people perform better. But I also just want to say, we should have people, more and more people actually sitting for the test. Black and Latino people. Well, to be honest, even in the percentage that they're taking the test, they're not getting in. But overall, it's such a small percentage that's taking the test, so we have to really increase that. And I think the Asian community did that combined with the prep.
So would that mean you would be more in favor of getting more monies from the city budget towards that initiative?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Is that something that you would say now, or is that something that you would kind of have to kind of confer with your staff in an effort to, make a more definitive public statement?
No, I think there should be money in the budget to do that, 100%.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Public.
Thank you, Mr. Mosley. Mr. Kim.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Public Advocate, it's good to see you. And thank you for your consistent stance on this issue. For several years now, you've been an outspoken person on this matter.
Back when I had long hair.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned Townsend Harris. That was an intriguing point. And all this time I thought Townsend was a diverse based on the measurements of entrance. And do you have any data of
What we looked up was,
Yeah.
I think, Eleanor Roosevelt and Townsend Harris. One of them was 3% black, and one of them was 5%. Another was 9% Latino, and 11%.
And those schools are looking at multiple measurements for
Yes.
entrance, and it's not based on a single test
Oh.
measurement. Interesting. Okay. If you didn't get into Brooklyn Tech back then, is there someone that you could have called, a local council member or, a connected person to try to get into Brooklyn Tech?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Right now, if somebody calls you and say, "Hey, my kid didn't get in, can you make a phone call to the chancellor to get into Brooklyn Tech?" Could that happen?
No, as a matter of fact, I sat with a bunch of Brooklyn Tech students because I wanted to hear their opinion, and it was mixed, as you would imagine. They were brilliant on it. There was one gentleman, he did happen to be white. I was telling him, I was actually presenting my proposal of having access points that are both, and he didn't even agree with that because he said that knowing his parents, they would just pay whomever they need to pay and try to influence the process. We saw that happen in college recently. And I think, if we look at Townsend and Eleanor Roosevelt, that you have a better chance of manipulating that multiple criteria system, and it's still not working.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Mr. Taylor.
I yield to Mr. Brown.
I'm sorry, sir?
I yield.
You're yielding.
Yes. It's good to see you, Public Advocate.
You too.
You're yielding to Miss Simon.
Oh, okay. Absolutely. That's what I didn't say that?
Good morning, afternoon now.
Afternoon.
Thank you for your testimony. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about your experience. And I understand from your perspective that the test gave you an opening access to Brooklyn Tech that you wouldn't have had otherwise. My concern is that you're one person. And it is very difficult from an educational point of view when you're dealing with 1.1 million students to make a decision based on individual anecdotal experiences. And I guess I want to know what it is you believe the SHSAT tests. Because we don't have a lot of data to support what it really tests. And so I'm curious what you believe about the SHSAT.
And I appreciate that, and I actually have same concerns. But I think my experience is less anecdotal than people are admitting. So I mentioned 3 people who had similar experiences, and one of them would have been left back. And as I mentioned, in the 90s, over 50% of the students were black and Latino, and most of the people I hung out with, usually people who are in trouble hanging out with other people who get in trouble. And so most of them had similar experiences as well. So it wasn't anecdotal in that school. It seemed to be a very normal thing that people, well, not normal. There were a lot of us that had issues that would not have gotten this education, period. And my thing is, I still, for the life of me, don't understand why we have to take that access point away when we can add another access point. And to your question directly, I'm not a genius in analytics of those tests. I wish the chancellor was still here, because my understanding was they had their own study that they didn't release publicly that actually showed that the test was a pretty good predictor of people who were going to succeed, and they didn't release it because it showed that. And you can look at the graduation rate, you can look at whatever you want, and you will see that the people who go to tech do well for whatever reason. And I just want people to have access points. But again, what I'm saying is I support getting another access point in there. I just don't understand why we have to take one away.
So let me ask you a question. Do you accept the premise that smart kids are going to do well in high school?
I didn't.
Okay, good. Okay. So
Yes, no.
You guess no? You don't think smart kids are going to do well in high school?
They might.
In your experience, that's true. I guess the concern we have here is that the test is actually not identifying smart kids, or that it's not very well identifying the group of kids that could do well in those schools. So
Why was it identifying that 20 years ago? And why
well,
is it not?
actually, it probably wasn't identifying it as well as you think it did.
Okay.
Because, in fact, if you look at the bill jacket and if you look at why this test or why this was mandated by the state, it was to get ahead of and to get out in front of a study that looked at allegations of racial disparities in the specialized schools, and primarily, obviously, the biggest one is Stuyvesant, more than Tech, for example, in Bronx Science, and so that's troubling. There is a real question as to whether or not the state should have done that, because this, in fact, is the only instance in the entire state where the state is actually interceding in admissions decisions for any local school district. And the only reason that this happened was because of fear that the schools were going to be destroyed because we were going to be looking at the possible racial disparities and the admissions to these schools. So there's some real concerns about the real facts around why these schools came into, why this test was mandated at the state level, and we're trying to fix that. So we're open to hearing how that might be. I mean, personally, I think the state shouldn't even be involved in this. But the only reason we're at this hearing is not because there are no problems in the school districts, or the entire system, but because this is the only thing that is before the state legislature.
Ms. Simon, is there a question?
So, there was a question.
Well, I would say, no,
So, but, go ahead.
I accept all of that. And whatever the intent was, but at least for 20 or 30 years, it didn't work in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I'd like to know why. But I also just would like, and I know what's before the state, but I mentioned two schools, Eleanor Roosevelt and Townsend, that nobody seems to be looking at. Like, we're spending all the time on 3 schools, primarily, or 8, which we don't have control over, and ignoring the schools that we can, right now, change who goes to Eleanor Roosevelt and who goes to Townsend Harris.
And I don't disagree, but that's a matter for the city Department of Education. It's not a matter for the state, unfortunately. Thank you.
Mr. Barron.
First, I find it incredible for you to say that if I didn't pass that test, I wouldn't have gotten in. That's what you said. If I didn't pass, if it wasn't for the test, I wouldn't have gotten in. Which means what? It means either you didn't have the grade point average, or there were other students who had a higher grade point average than you who failed the test, and you took their seat because you passed the test that perhaps they couldn't pass. You helped make our point. I think there's a case being made that when people can study for the test, and even if they don't study for the test, I know a young man in Philippa Schuyler. He had like a 65-point grade average. His friends had a 90 average. He passed the test to Brooklyn Tech. They didn't. He went on to be mediocre in Brooklyn Tech. They went on to elite colleges and did excellently. I think you're a perfect example of why we need to get rid of the test. And people need to understand.
Please.
Shut up. People need to understand that it's not about your individualism. I passed the test. This is what some of blacks are saying. I passed the test and I did good. Why can't you? You are ignoring the reality. I don't care what you say about the other schools, and we shouldn't let you and others deflect the strategy away from the 3 schools to talk about other schools that the city can take care of. We're going to do that. We're going to deal with the city and those other schools, but stick to the point. Those 3 high schools, that test was born out of racism. I hope you stayed for Walliver Stewart's testimony, because it was born out of racism and it's achieving its objective.
and that is to keep us out of these specialized high schools. It is doing that, and it's not because our students are not smart. We don't want to have people who just know how to take a test. And you're right, some of them will be successful, but it won't be because of a test. That is not making any pedagogical sense to think that a test makes you better in a high school. It does not. And it's not a true indicator. You obviously had some other things that, given a chance to go in there, you could succeed. It wasn't the test, because tests don't do that. No tests do that. No tests do that. Grade point average does. So I just find it incredible that black leaders could come up and be against something. This is the reality. 9% now, I don't care what you say. It is 9% now, no matter what's being done. And if we do this plan, it goes up to 45%. I don't see how anybody can be against that. But
Mr. Williams, please respond.
Yes, thank you for presenting that. I view it a little differently. Perhaps unlike you, I think that all the students have ability to show that they're smart, whether they have good grades or not. And so there were students like me, and there are students who had worse grades than me that I think are smarter than me. And I disagree with you.
think that too.
I disagree with you that simply grade point average is an indicator of intelligence.
I didn't say that. Mr. Chair, I just got to correct
I
you.
understand, but
I
let
did
him
not-
respond.
I know, but I don't want him to say stuff that I didn't say. I didn't say grade point average is the only indication for intelligence. This is because he has a weak argument, so he's
Nope,
misquoting
you
it.
said grades do that.
Let the
and
man
I'm glad
speak.
that we have it in the script, because you said grades do that. So I'm responding to that. I'm saying that grades do not necessarily do that. I,
Test
just
does.
myself and others can show that grades itself are not the only indication of whether someone is intelligent or not. What I am saying is I want everybody to have access points. I'm not sure why you firmly believe that people like me who were able to show what they can do on a test don't have the same, should not have the same access to quality
didn't say
education.
I didn't say that. I said because you did well on a test doesn't measure your academic capabilities in a high school. And
Well-
nor did I say that grade point average is the only. We said multiple variables because students have 1,000 ways of learning. They
then-
have more ways of learning
Got it.
than teachers know how.
And the
Let me
multiple
finish, let me
criteria
finish, let me
schools, like,
finish.
you
Let
have
me
Mr.
finish. Well,
Mr.
then we can
Williams,
argue
do
back
let
and
him
forth.
finish.
Sure. But he asked a question.
Let me, I ain't
answer.
asked you no
You'll have an
question yet.
ample
Did
time
ask a
to
question.
answer.
Okay,
I'm
thank
not
you.
finished.
Mr.
I'm not
Barron.
finished. Thank you. Thank you. I'm saying to you that students have more ways to learn than teachers know how to teach.
Agreed.
They know how to learn. Grade point average is just one. We say
Agreed.
multiple variables.
Agreed.
Student portfolios and projects is another. Student could have all kinds of independent study projects they do. That's another. And students can be recommended by principals and teachers. That's another.
Agreed.
So there are multiple criteria. And you're going to sit there and say that this one test is what helped you to get in and helped you to be successful. That is not true.
What
You're
I have
very
said-
intelligent. You're very intelligent.
Let me know when I can speak.
Mr.
Well,
Barron,
let me-
let
me
him
finish.
answer,
No,
please.
let me finish.
Sure.
You
Just let me
speak.
know when I can speak.
You speak when I'm finished.
Okay,
when I'm
I will.
finished, you speak.
You finished a few times, though.
You speak when
Excuse
I'm
me,
finished.
gentlemen,
You speak
let's
when I'm
be
finished.
civil here.
We are
okay?
civil. He's just interrupted and I'm
Mr.
interrupting.
Barron, I
and we're not
understand. But
uncivilized.
please try to condense your question.
Well, I will if he would stop interrupting me.
He's doing okay.
My deepest
but-
and sincerest apologies.
Mr.
Assemblyman.
Williams, please.
Please, control yourself. You'll get a chance to speak.
I have Tourette
Calm
syndrome. It's a
down,
little
calm
difficult.
down. Don't try to use that as an excuse.
What's your excuse?
You should control yourself. It has nothing to do with your situation. It's all the fact that you have a weak argument that's
Mr.
baseless.
Barron, please
Very strong.
continue.
That's
Right,
why you won't let me
bottom
finish
line,
it.
the
Mr.
bottom
Williams,
line, the
all you're
bottom
doing
line.
is antagonizing Mr. Barron.
I'm having a
That's
good
what
time.
Barron-
man.
that's what he's doing,
You
Mr.
are
Chairman.
certainly antagonizing
That's
Mr. Williams, so let's get
only
right
thing
down
I'ma say
to the point.
is that I am surprised that I thought that you would take this as a public advocate, that the majority of the children in public schools is black and Latino, and the public advocate is not supporting a bill that's going to get us from 9% to 45%. Shame on you.
And
Mr.
ditto.
Williams, you make your, and we'll,
Sure.
then we'll
It's okay.
move on
I would
to
say
the next.
ditto on the shame on you because I am presenting something that I think can provide access to everyone without pitting the Asian community against the Black and Latino community, and that's what.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, please.
I just
Mr.
want
Williams.
to. I just would like to be able to finish what
Yes,
I'm saying.
please.
I think my argument is particularly strong. That's why I keep getting interrupted. And so the issue with multiple criteria, as we've mentioned, I've mentioned a number of multiple criteria school right now that looks at grades and other things that we can look at and is not diverse, is abysmally segregated. And so the question is, what about the schools right now that do exactly what this bill says and is not diverse? As I mentioned earlier, if we remove these schools, period, and they didn't exist, we'd have the most segregated school system in the country, and we have the abysmal ability to educate Black and brown people. And what I'm saying is that I believe everyone should have access points to show what they can do. It just so happened that mine were tests for whatever reason, whether it was my behavior, as I mentioned, my grades and cutting school, all throughout school until frankly, until grad school, but whatever. We looked at my grades in elementary school and junior high. People thought I was going to go a different route. What I'm saying is people like me should have access point to a quality education as well. And what that was for me, that access point, was that test. I am also saying that people who can show what they can do in the multiple criteria should also have an access point to have access to quality education. I do not think we have to pit those two together. Some of the folks who support me because I'm here don't support my plan, but I do. I think we can have seats for both people, and I think it satisfies a multitude of communities. And if you can't, any system is going to get cheated on, I'll tell you that, right? So whether it's test prep or making a call, but if you have two systems, maybe it will lessen that because everybody will see that they have an access point that speaks to their particular experience. And it is individual experiences that make up community experiences.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Barron, let us move on.
Just the last thing, I just want to correct something. We are not pitting, my bill does not pit the Black community against the Asian community. Your rhetoric does. My bill says equal access, 7% for everybody in every school. That's equal access. It is only your rhetoric that creates that division. Thank you.
And yours, thank you.
Ms. Bashad.
Hi, Mr. Public Advocate. Thank you for coming in and
Yes, I remember.
testifying. When we talk about academic ability, I think you missed my testimony in terms of having academic ability, being a special ed, being an ADD, having attention deficit disorder. Yet, somehow, I was able to excel in mathematics, electrical engineering, and got accepted to top business schools, where I did horrible in the standardized tests to get admitted, but they still accepted me. You talked about back in the 80s and the 90s, the percentage of Blacks attending Brooklyn Tech was a lot higher than not what it is now. And I want to say that it's inaccurate to make that comparison because there was a housing movement that happened over time in Fort Greene. So with the contribution of gentrification, housing, redlining, you had more whites coming into the neighborhood, which changed the perception of going to Brooklyn Tech being okay. Back in the days, in the 80s, I remember when the Black students who went to Brooklyn Tech, they would say, oh, that's where the smart hoodlums would go. White parents did not want, many of them did not want their children to go to the school because it was a safety issue. And many Black parents didn't want their kids to go to that school. So the threshold of admittance was a lot lower. So with the change of gentrification and so forth, things have changed kind of completely, where there was a more entrance of going to the school, more applications, more people applying, and therefore the threshold had risen. So I want to make that point that there's a lot of factors why an institution like Brooklyn Tech now have less minorities than it did back in the days. I also want to point out, I also agree with Barron regarding that this whole process, this whole movement, we're not faulting the Asian community. In fact, I actually donated to a few organizations who prep their kids because I felt that these preparatory organizations were the only way. Were the only way to try to fight the barriers of this oppressed system in terms of getting into these specialized high school. So I'm a big supporter. However, that should not be the learning environment for any of our kids. And that's why I believe that there should be other mechanism, and quite frankly, what Yale and other elite institutions are considering, Harvard, University of Chicago, eliminating their standardized tests because they want to admit students on a wholesome way. So, my question to you is, you're the people's advocate. You were elected to be the public advocate. I do have a problem with you not standing up for equity across New York City. You have 67% of your Black and Latino students who are, many of them who are top rank. And for some reason, they're not getting a seat at the table. You have to address that. And let me tell you, I stand strong on what I believe in. And I have not gotten attacks from any of my Asian community, South Asian community, because this is not about Black versus Asian. It has nothing to do with that. This has to do about a disparity that exists, and we cannot make excuses. Yes, we know that there's an issue across the whole board in our educational system, from kindergarten to high school. But right now, we're here to address a segment of that disparity, which is the specialized high school.
Excuse me, Ms. Bashad, is there a question?
Yes, there's a question. My question is, why, as a public advocate, you're not standing up for our students across the board?
Thank you. One, I would absolutely say that even when I'm personally attacked, I stand up for what I believe in. That's for sure. Two, I am 100% all standing up for students. Your personal story was amazing. I listened to your story in the back. I thought it was a great personal story. And again, examples that people have different stories that show what they can do, which is a good example of why I'm presenting two different access points, so that both you and I can get into a specialized high school, but it seems to be rejected. I would reject the notion that standing up for all students, including Asian students, is not standing up for all students. I am standing up for Black, Latino, white, Asian. When it comes to gentrification, there definitely was a change. I will say I came from Starrett City, so I didn't live in Fort Greene, and most of the people who are gentrifying don't look like the people who are in Brooklyn Tech. They are primarily Asian, so that the gentrification, while does have a part of it, isn't the bigger one. I also heard that you went to LaGuardia, which I think is amazing, but to me it's tantamount to saying that LaGuardia should no longer have an audition. We should just take it away. We should just have 7% of all good singers go to LaGuardia. I'm not sure that
Auditioning is not culturally biased.
As I said, it will be tantamount to saying let's just have 7% of all the singers in the city go to LaGuardia. Maybe, maybe not, but we should have a discussion of what that impact would be. I actually auditioned. I think I'm a pretty good actor. I'm actually in the show now. But I didn't pass the LaGuardia audition. I froze up and was terrified, and I didn't get in. That's because I didn't pass the audition, and I'm not sure that there should have been something else that should have been used. I don't think anybody who put this bill in necessarily is saying I'm against the Asian community, but as leaders, we should know and realize when we put something forth, who will it affect, and let's try to have the conversation in a way that deals with them as well. And also what I'll keep pushing back that nobody seems to respond to is that some of the best multiple criteria school, the ones that we're, I guess, trying to emulate right now, are not diverse. And so I'm not sure how that necessarily solves the issue that we're talking about.
Thank you, Ms. Bashar. We must move on
Just
here.
one note.
Go ahead.
Just on LaGuardia High School. You cannot compare LaGuardia High School, which is probably the best specialized high school, because if you look at the makeup of LaGuardia High School, there's no disparity, okay? It's people from all socioeconomic background, all race, ethnicity, religion. So that's why I look at LaGuardia as more of a fairer model. You don't have to like prep to go into that school. You can just be born with a great voice, or you can, take singing lessons. Whatever it may be, it's not culturally biased. And again, we're not addressing LaGuardia High School because it's a very diverse, well-diverse school.
I would submit
Thank you.
that taking singing lessons
The point's
is
been made.
prep.
Okay. Let us move on.
Sure.
I never
Okay.
took singing lessons.
Thank
and
you,
I got-
Ms. Bashar.
And I never practiced for the test.
Okay. Miss Walker.
I don't know. My notes have like all sorts of black hoodlums, equity. I guess I'll start by saying that the conversation regarding equity, I think, is an important conversation, and I'm sure it's a conversation that you have on a number of occasions. But there's a perfect picture of what depicts equity. It's some kids standing on a box. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about what that?
Yes, it shows how people confuse equality with equity. And when we say equality, we give the same resources. It doesn't amount for all the things that were lost before. And so if you give people the same box and they're trying to look over a fence, it doesn't account for some people's box was shorter to begin with. And so they just have a bigger box, but they still can't look over the fence. You have to give an abundance to the young man who has a smaller box to begin with.
And so I commend you for fighting for more resources for our students on the ground at the K through 8 levels so that we can have a more equitable educational experience as opposed to what I'm thinking that I'm hearing, which is more about equality as opposed to equity. In fact, you mentioned about the school systems, even where the city or others may be in control of, still are very segregated. And from what I understand, also, being a student from Ocean Hill, Brownsville, I'm very particularly in tune with Brown versus Board of Education. And there's something in there which sort of determines de facto segregation, which includes segregation whether or not it's by law. And as a result of that, the Department of Justice has created an educational opportunities division, which is very similar to the work that you've done with respect to minority policing or policing in minority communities, where if there is a situation where it's a discriminatory impact on policing, I believe we were even under a federal monitor to show that discrimination existed. The Department of Justice sort of called it out, though they did not bring a case against it. It was an avenue that could have been utilized. So I submit to you also, Mr. Public Advocate, that under the Educational Opportunities Division of the Department of Justice, would you consider it as an opportunity to work with congressional colleagues in order to discuss the issue of segregation within our public school systems across the board so that it doesn't become just an attack on this one test, but we're really getting at the root and cause of the problem?
I absolutely would. Thank you for presenting that. I would also say, I just hope folks, particularly Black Latino leaders, remember that we may disagree on this one thing with the test, but we all agree that the system itself is problematic, and I just want to make sure that that doesn't get lost as we go back and forth with these discussions.
Thank you. And lastly, you know, when we talk about what may have changed, the dynamics of Brooklyn Tech and the sort of statistical analysis of diversity, one of the things that I can say that I remember that changed is the fact that we had a Black principal, Lee McCaskill. And, you know, he sort of put forth a very targeted approach with respect to being in communication with many of the other Black principals across New York City and particularly across Brooklyn to be able to ensure that those schools, even knew that Brooklyn Tech existed. So I do commend him for that. And now I believe that we're also dealing with the issue of diversity at the administrative levels with many of these specialized high schools and other high schools as well. So when you are conducting your investigations into segregation at the school level to address this particular issue, could you also take a look at segregation with respect to principals and administrators within these systems as well?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Ms. Walker. Ms. Seawright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Public Advocate, I want to thank you for being here today. Your testimony, I think, is very important, and I really appreciate being able to hear you as an alum, and you've accomplished so much. So thank you and congratulations. I just have a quick question. You've mentioned more access points. Could you just elaborate on that more?
Yeah, I do believe that diversity is a tremendous problem in this system, and including the specialized high school. I want to have a better understanding of why, and I did some research, and I know that with everybody taking the test and actually prepping, the scores have skewed higher because of that. And so I do think some more test prep would assist, but there is a lot of validity in someone saying one test cannot show what you can do. And so we should talk about the system as a whole. Where are there access points for people to show what they can do? And I think a test is one way. As a matter of fact, test is the only thing that saved my school career, whether it was a test to get junior high school, a test to get into tech, and my SAT. Otherwise, I would have had a horrible school career. But, you know, a lot of people, probably more people, are afraid of tests than are not. So I think that we should have an access point to the credit of all of the assembly members who are bringing this up that can show multiple criteria so that people can show what they can do outside of one test on one day. And so what I have submitted is as a possibility, in addition to opening other schools, in addition to additional gifted and talented junior high schools, is maybe we look at how can we have some of the seats that look at someone like me who was able to show what I could do on that one day, and someone like Assemblymember Bouchat who had the reverse, but could show what they can do when using multiple criteria.
Thank you. Mr. Colton.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Public Advocate, I was very impressed with your personal story and with your courage in terms of fighting for the things that are important. And the fact that you are sitting here today as the public advocate of the city of New York, I think indicates a lot more people also are very impressed with what they have seen. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in the Chancellor's testimony was that there are a lot of students who fall just below what would be the mark to admit. Do you think one of the ways of creating more access points and more access to specialized schools would be expanding the number of specialized schools and the number of seats so that it can accommodate all those children who have shown the ability to be able to benefit from a specialized school?
So 100% I support expanding more schools. I support expanding more quality schools generally. And I do support that part of the mayor's plan, that make sure that we can get some more people in the Discovery program who just missed the cutoff to be able to go in as well. So I support all of those. I also I very much appreciate the accolades of what I've been able to accomplish. I also just want to make sure I don't diminish people who weren't able to take that test, like one of your members who shared her own story, because they, and of course she, has accomplished as much as well. And so it kind of proves my point that there are two ways to show what you can do, and both ways have people who can excel in them.
And you also have mentioned the matter of funding with CFE, which I think is a very, very important fight that in many ways we need to devote even more attention to, and this may be a distraction from that fight. But do you think that the fact that the New York City schools have been at a disadvantage for decades, really, in terms of not receiving their fair share of aid, has contributed to the fact of the problems that we see, not only in the specialized schools in terms of a lack of diversity, but in general in terms of the quality education that our children in New York City have been able to get?
So I'll say two things. One, 100%. The prolonged years of not having the money we deserve absolutely have an effect. But I don't want to also lose sight of the systemic impacts of race that has occurred, even with the monies that do exist. And so that systemic issue has to be a part of the conversation as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Colton. To close, Ms. Hindman. Ms. Hindman, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Public Advocate. I'm not sure how to address you, but congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to talk about a different aspect, because one of the things the Public Advocate's Office can do is conduct studies or investigations. And there's been a lot of talk about if we just increase the number of gifted and talented programs across the city, that will be one way to look at a long-term increase of education for children going into who want to go into these specialized high schools. Would it be possible for your office to conduct a study of all of the G&T programs in the city of New York, number one, and number two, to do an investigation of how many of those programs are the teachers certified in the Renzulli or the Buck Institute? And now the reason for my question, or to ask you to do these studies, is as it stands right now, and I represent Queens, and we have a couple of G&T programs, and we were able to get a G&T program for our middle school students, but the principal could have just taken it and said, okay, we have a G&T, but she then had to find the money to pay for teachers to get this training. And you're talking about $2,500 that either she had to come up with. When you're a principal with a budget, that's kind of hard to do. The second thing is some teachers were willing to pay for it themselves. But we talk about the lack of teacher continuing education in the city of New York. And although we try to get more money funded in the budget, it wasn't what we would like it to be, would have liked it to be. But the reason for the studies is a lot of these children are in G&T programs in name only. They are studying just like their peers are, the same curriculum, the same Common Core curriculum, and then after the tests have been administered, the ELA and the math test, there's really no more, they're not getting any more enrichment. So if the study could talk about what are they doing in addition to the Common Core standards that these children are learning, and what are they doing differently, and are these teachers certified? Because there is definitely a lack, and I don't put the onus so much on the teachers because it's expensive. And to do that as well as in addition to everything else is important. So I would really like your office, I have introduced legislation to address this, but I think you could do it faster than me, trying to get a bill done. So that's my ask of you.
I appreciate it, and I'm looking at my folks to try to make sure we reach out to your office, talk about it a little bit more. I think it's something we might be able to do. I would say I've been in office exactly 2 months, and unlike people who got elected the year before, I've had transition at the same time that I'm trying to make sure the office is open. So if I can have a little time to make sure we hire some staff, and I can jump on that. But I do like that kind of approach, and I think that's something the Public Advocate's Office is here to do. So I'd love to reach out to you to push that.
Ms. Hinman, thank you very much.
Heidman.
Jeez. Mr. Public Advocate, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming here, and thank you for honestly answering the questions we put forward.
I thank you. A special thanks also to Chancellor Carranza, all of the Assembly members who actually are, and the Chancellor himself has been very brave when it comes to diversity issues, and I want to applaud him for that. Even though we disagree on this one small point, I think many of us here want to make sure that our school system is broken up and the desegregation, not broken up, but the desegregation leads to really good diversity and access points to quality education for everybody in the system.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Moving on.